Today on the Pitchbook podcast, Zac is pitching When Money Dies by Adam Ferguson, and I am pitching Quit by Annie Duke. Batter up! Zac, have you ever?
Matt.
How are you? Have you ever gambled before? Are you a gambling
One
guy?
time, just no,
Okay.
not good. I gambled once, and it was a lottery ticket. I split with somebody on a business trip. How about you?
You didn't win big? You didn't win the lottery?
I followed up 2 years later because I forgot about it, and I said, "Hey, did we ever win anything?" And he said, "No, we did not win." He did check
As he was diving
Okay.
through his money vault like Scrooge McDuck. He's like, "No,
Yes.
we didn't win. Sorry."
I know, I'm too trusting. If he could have won everything, and I wouldn't have known.
My
I
dad
didn't
always
think about it.
my dad always said, if you play the lottery, your chances are only slightly better of winning. Then he's like, it's just so
True.
So I have a quick gambling story, which because that's kind of what my book's about a little bit. I was just turned 21, and my dad said, "Hey, you're 21, you're an adult now. I'm taking you to some Indian land for a rite of passage." And this is when I lived in Oregon, and I was like, I was really confused. I'm like, are we doing some sort of weird Indian thing that doesn't make any sense since I'm not a Native American? I did not know what my dad was talking about. And so
that could have gone a lot of different ways.
It was very strange because he kept saying rite of passage, Indian land, and it's a surprise. He wouldn't tell me what we're doing. And it was on my birthday, the day I turned 21. And he has me start driving out towards the coast. And I'm still just super confused. Like, I have no idea what we're going to do. We get out, I start driving. All of a sudden, to my left, I see an Indian casino. And I'm like, oh, it finally dawns on me. Okay, my rite of passage is to gamble because I'm 21 now. And this is the quote unquote Indian land, which was the Indian casino. So we pull out, and he's, doing the dad thing. And he's like, "Yeah, Matt, I'm taking you gambling because I want to teach you a lesson. I want to teach you that you can gamble, and if you want to gamble, it's fine. It can be fun, but just only plan on gambling as much money as you're willing to lose, because you're always going to lose." I'm like, "Oh, okay, Dad, that makes sense. Great. I'm super stoked. I'm like, let's gamble. Let's go. I'm super excited." So we go in.
I got my whole paycheck.
I had no paychecks at the time, but luckily my dad spotted me some money, right? And we walk into the casino. It's super packed. Like, I can't even find a slot machine to go on. Suddenly, there's one that appears. This guy gets frustrated and he leaves. And so I'm like, "Oh, cool." So my dad gives me a $20 bill. I pop it into the machine. I start pulling. I'm just loving it. I'm losing money. These are quarter slots. I'm losing a quarter at a time each pull, but I don't care. It's so fun, hearing the bells and whistles and whatever. And I'm like, "Oh, this is awesome, Dad." And he's like, "Yeah, see, you just keep on losing." So the guy next to me, he disappears. He's like, "Okay, I'm out of here." So my dad's like, "Oh, cool. I'll sit right next to my son." He's like, "All right." He kind of gets this, the dad face. "Oh, I'll put some money in here and see what happens." So he puts like $10 in. He does one pull, his first pull. He pulls it. Ding, 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 ding. It's going crazy. He wins $75 on a quarter machine, his first pull. My gosh. And I turned to him while it's ringing, and I said, "Nice lesson, Dad." And he starts laughing. Great lesson. So anyway,
and he's like, "Let's go."
Yeah, well, he said, "Let's go to the buffet." So we actually ended up back pretty even after just gambling the rest of that money and hitting the buffet. So it was pretty funny. But
that is so great.
Yeah, it was the best part was just, "Nice lesson, Dad. Good job." He's just kind of like shaking his head. Oh,
backfire.
Man. It was great. Anyway, all right. Well, let's get started here, because my book today is called Quit. And when I say that, and it's by Annie Duke, you don't know who Annie Duke is. You're not a gambling person. When I say I read a book called Quit, what do you think?
Just stop. You're
failing.
Far ahead. Just
You're far ahead. Yeah, exactly.
That's an interesting. You don't hear that titles like that every day.
No, you do not.
Like Like lose.
Lose, quit. So it's funny because you and I often pick books about people that have persevered or,
Yeah.
kind of just trying to get better and be better. So when I read Quit, I was like, this is really interesting. And I knew a little bit of Annie Duke. Annie Duke is a professional or was a professional poker player. And so she won the World Series of Poker in like I think 2004, and she's written quite a few books. There's actually a book I want to read. I haven't read it yet. It's called Thinking in Bets. So you might find it kind of intriguing. But this whole book is all about the art of quitting, kind of the virtue of quitting.
Mm.
And she talks about it as a kind of a positive, like a strategic choice. Because often when you think about quitting, there's this stigma, right? Like you don't have what it takes. You're a quitter, right? And she kind of turns that on its head and says, basically recognizing the right time to quit is crucial. And she talks a lot about, and I think this probably comes from her betting background, obviously, because you got to know when to fold. She's basically talking about how if you have a hand, there's always a chance with no matter how bad your cards are, there's always a chance you could win. And people foolishly stay in with big pots when they should really fold and quit. So
Yeah.
that's what she
Yeah.
talks about. She gives a couple of actually good examples. The one that I remember, and you're from the Bay Area, so you may know this somewhat well. There's I don't remember what it's called, but it was basically like a high speed train that someone has had an idea to build between LA and the Bay Area, and it got funding, and it was projected. I'm making up the numbers, $20 million for in this length of time. And then they realized, oh, wait a minute, there's these giant mountains in between, like
Oh yeah.
Fresno and LA. And oh, by the way, there's some giant mountains in between the Bay Area and the Fresno area as well. So how are we going to cut through those mountains? They're like, oh, I don't know. So they're like, well, you know what? We need more funding. It's going to take longer time. And again, this is kind of classic government, but there's definitely some corollaries in our lives. And she talks about how you often end up doing the easy part. And so they ended up building the high speed train between the valley, and they still haven't figured out how they're going to cut through the mountains and the expense that it's going to cost. But yet they still built this high speed train really to nowhere, right? Because you know that valley is not nearly as populated as the Bay Area and LA.
Yeah.
And then the governor actually signed in, to spend more money on this thing. They still don't have a plan of how they're going to cut through the mountains at a reasonable cost. So it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, when they should have just, basically, she says, they should have just realized, hey, this isn't going to work. Let's cut our losses and just stop doing this thing. Because not to mention, it's pretty easy. It's a pretty short flight, from LA to San Francisco. They don't even really need a train. So anyway, she gives an example like that. She talks about some other companies that specifically make quitting not a requirement, but thinking about quitting when you get to certain stages as a requirement.
Mhm.
So I can't remember exactly what she says. It's something about you got to think of it like you're making a dancing monkey and a box. It's easy to make the box, but it's difficult to train the monkey to dance. So, and maybe I had that wrong a little bit, but she essentially says like the high speed rail in the Fresno Valley is easy to build, and that's the box. Training the monkey is cutting through the mountains and getting it finished. And if you can't train the monkey, then don't build the box. This is basically what she talks about, and that's a company that kind of has adopted that philosophy. So she talks about that. She actually talks about getting a quitting coach. So somebody that's from the outside that says, "Hey, Zach, this is actually a huge mistake. Maybe you should stop doing this."
It's a
That's
great
that.
business idea. Just quit right now.
Just quit. She
Immediately.
she talks about a company that a guy who thought it was best to not get funding and just bootstrap, and he kept bootstrapping and bootstrapping, and all of his competitors that had a similar product ended up surpassing him, and all that money that he invested personally, he ended up losing because these other guys who did get some capital were beating him, and he just couldn't compete. And so he ended up losing more money than if he had just taken some venture capital and use it. So anyway, she just talks a little bit about this. The only issue, so the issue I had with the book the whole time is I'm kind of like, I'm pretty goal oriented, and I try to be focused on what I'm trying to accomplish. And obviously, I'm not perfect, but like when she's sitting there saying like, "Oh, you got to quit, do this, do that," I'm kind of a little skeptical the whole time
Okay.
until she gets to the very end, um, when she talks about just basically it's good to set goals, because you don't get that sense from her when she's first talking through the whole book. But at the very end, she talks about like being flexible with your goals and ultimately setting a goal like, hey, I'm going to work on this goal unless this, unless that. Like if X happens, I'm going to quit the goal. She talks actually about marathon runners who would actually run with like a broken leg, like they'll break their leg or whatever, but they'll still keep running even in the pain. They'll run through the pain, and ultimately it keeps them from running a marathon the next month or 2 months from then, because they push so hard through it and they end up hurting themselves for the future. So that's one example she gives is, I'm going to run this marathon unless I break my leg, and then I'm not going to then I'm going to quit. You know what I mean? So she kind of looks at
Oh
quitting as
yeah.
a bit of a virtue. And so that kind of wrapped it up for me a little bit better when she says, look, when you make your goal, that's fine, just realize that you might want to have some quitting triggers in there for your own safety.
Like a stop loss. Just
Yeah,
once I get to this point, I'm committed to be done. Even if you look over the horizon, you're almost there.
yeah, she talks a lot about like some of the biases that we have, like loss aversion, right? You're probably
Mm-hmm.
familiar with that.
Yeah.
Escalation of commitment. She talks about, I think that she talks about, when people believe something crazy and it's been debunked, they'll actually believe it even further because they don't want to be, known as wrong. She talked about the sunk cost fallacy. Um, you
Yes.
know,
This
uh,
sounds like thinking fast and slow.
yeah,
I mean, a
actually,
lot of this
it's funny that you say
really
that.
similar.
It's funny that since you pitched that book to me, I have not read that book yet. But there's probably been 5 books I've listened to that taught that literally that quote. Is it Kinnaman? Is that his name?
Kahneman,
Kahneman.
Daniel
Kahneman.
Kahneman,
Kahneman. Yeah,
and
Daniel Kahneman.
Amos Tversky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she actually quotes him quite a bit. So
Okay.
it's interesting, but so it's kind of a cool, interesting take. Again, it did take me a little bit to come around because I kind of feel like there's been this thought lately that people are like too try hard, too like too much, and they try too hard, and they are too focused on their goals, and they're missing out on life. And I think that's a bit of a weird, um, I don't know, philosophy to have lately. And so when I read this, I was like, oh no, she's one of those ones that's like, it's like, oh, just be happy and go roll in the flowers and don't worry about where your next paycheck comes from. But then again, towards the end, she kind of comes back and just says, have goals, but have some built-in stopping points or stopping parameters. Um, so ultimately, I'd probably give this a triple, maybe. It's pretty interesting, and it probably applies to some people more than others. Um, but yeah, that's my take on the
Okay.
book.
Do you? So I watched a video the other day. It was David Goggins. Do you know who that
Oh yeah,
is?
yeah.
Have you
David
heard that name? Or
is it
he
Goggins?
wrote
Yeah, he's the
Goggins.
yeah, yeah. He's the is
I don't
he
even want to mispronounce his name because he might show up at my house and just kill me.
he's
But
what is that book that he's famous for?
he is called "Can't Hurt Me,"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which I haven't read it, but I've had a couple friends read it and
I have read
recommend
that,
it.
but it's been a while.
Okay, so I was doom scrolling on social media and I see this video of him and it's about 10 minutes. I'm like, I'm going to watch it. And it was interesting to hear his story because he would be the antithesis of maybe her.
Exactly.
He said he had to, he goes through his life story, talks about like steel plating his brain to just make him indestructible. Like he'll just push through, like you described, running with broken ankle or,
Yeah.
shin splints and I think he had a broken leg and just kept running. But I'm taking this to the extreme, bringing him up. I think in life there have to be points when you say, "Is this worth continued effort, capital, energy, relationships, whatever it is I'm doing?" Um, there is a point where quitting can make sense, and you can honorably step away and say, "I think I'm out here."
Yeah, it's funny. I'm a big boxing guy, and there are times when people will be frustrated, or there'll be some criticism of the trainer by not throwing in the towel, and part of the issue with some of the CTE and the brain damage that comes from boxing is that sometimes people don't get knocked out. They just keep taking punches and punches over time, when really somebody needs to kind of protect that person from themselves.
Yeah.
Because it's quitting on the stool or quitting in a boxing match is like the worst thing you can do. So there's a lot of trainers that talk about how you've got to be aware that you need to protect the fighter from themselves. Anyway, so I just like the fact that you're right. He's very much the antithesis of of the quit mentality, and I think there's just a bit of probably a happy medium between the two. And not that she says quit on everything, but happy
Right.
medium between the two of reaching for your goals. And the one thing I would think is something like, hey, I'm so focused on these goals at work that I'm neglecting my family. Well, that's probably not a good situation to be in, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's all. I to me it was kind of like, okay, just be. I don't think I'm in danger of overcommitting to things, personally. But the one thing I would try to apply to my life is just thinking about it as I start to set goals for myself. Okay, at what point is there a sunk cost that I'm in too deep in this, and I should just cut my losses,
Yeah.
or be just more self aware of what's going on, that I might need to like readjust where I'm going. So
It's
anyway,
good to
that's
evaluate. And
that's
culturally, it's okay to stop.
right.
I think we're in this culture where you just have to go, 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 no matter what at any cost. And it's like there are costs. I could be doing something else.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's the
Cool.
spirit I'm taking that book. That's good.
It was definitely
Uh,
interesting, and again, I think the poker background helps her quite a bit, because learning how to fold in poker is probably one of the probably the most important thing you can do, right? It's to
yeah,
kind of know
yeah.
your chances. So, all right, tell me about When Money Dies.
All
Tell
right.
me
This
tell
was
me
a
about how you came across this book. I think this book was written before you were born, right?
yeah,
Pretty
this
much.
book was written in 1975. So you have to think about the time that it was written. In the early 70s to early 80s, the
So this
US went
is
through a period of inflation. There were like three big waves where inflation, I think when this book was written, inflation was at about 10%. Just the price of goods changed
this is
10% year over
gas
year.
gas line times, right? Like waiting in line for gas.
Yes, high unemployment, high interest rates. It feels a little similar to today. So I thought this might be a book that people might resonate with,
Yeah.
but this is to the extreme. So When Money Dies is written in 1975 when the US was going through a high inflation period. But the book is actually written about the Weimar Republic
Hmm.
post World War One. So the Germany had just suffered a loss. That was the war to end all wars. They lost, and the international community said, look, you've got to make reparation payments. So Germany is trying to make these payments and realizes they just can't do it. So they start printing money. And I'm not going to go through the book is more like a journal from that period, but I'm going to share a couple quotes that are just like, holy cow. Just imagine this if this ever happened, right, in the US. I'm not saying that it will, but money can die. Uh, they said he says between 1913 and the end of 1921, the currency in circulation increased by 64 times. So you've got what is that, 8-year period where the currency 64 times. An average number of domestic articles purchased in 1914 for 100 corona now cost 8,260 corona. So just massive expense. So it's almost like, to give everyone a thought experiment, we all want an extra $1 million, right? But if everyone got $1 million at the same time, what happens? We're all kind of the same. We're not any further ahead or behind because we all just got the same amount,
Yeah.
because you have price inflation. So the currency is being debased. And at one point, it talks about there were people that were, the currency became so devalued, and this was before digital currency, that going to your bank or using a debit card, they had paper currency. People were filling wheelbarrows with money to buy a loaf of bread. Like your shopping is load up the trunk with cash because it's just worthless. And they just could not get out of this cycle of of money printing. uh, in the book, he says that was the period in which grand and upright pianos were to be found in the most unmusical households. Anyone who was alive to the realities of inflation, he said, could safeguard himself against losses in paper currency by buying assets which would maintain their value: houses, real estate, manufactured good, raw materials, and so forth. So he talks about how people were buying pianos because the piano was scarce, right? And you
Hmm.
have that in your house, and as the currency's deflating, you have this piano that's worth something. So people were just kind of grasping onto things. At one point, farmers were withholding food because they knew, if we withhold, the price tomorrow is going to go up significantly and I can sell the goods tomorrow. So they would just kind of withhold. But as they're withholding food, it just makes the price go up higher and higher. He says the Reichsbank was unstoppable. Whole denominations of mark notes were worthless almost on leaving the presses. The entire currency of the country was autumn. As a country, as autumn came, had to be renewed again and again whenever the price of a single tram fare, typical of the value of the lowest unit in circulation, soared on its unflagging upward career. Even from this point of view, the policy of inflation must have been a most costly business. So even as they're printing the money, the cost to print was cost more than the money was worth that they were actually printing. So it obviously went really south. He says obviously something goes on only until the moment when it cannot, and then it comes suddenly. So it was a really interesting book just to read. It's, it's only a couple hundred pages long, but it's fascinating to hear through this period of time how the currency totally became debased. Unemployment was rampant. Business was just, they couldn't do trade with other countries. And eventually everything just collapsed. And what was interesting reading the book is the mindset of the people. I'm just going to share a couple more quotes. He said they had little enthusiasm left for democracy and were themselves moving towards authoritarianism through sheer weariness of spirit and almost complete indifference to anything except their own lack of material comforts. The chancellor was to get his enabling act on October 13th. The Volkspartei's manifesto of October 4th, therefore, only reflected national predilections when it asserted that the helm of the ship of state must be put over to the right. Marxism has ruined Germany. An end must be made to this policy of compromise. Away with the socialists, out with the government. So they went from a socialist state, and the mindset shifted towards fascism and towards Nazism. So some have argued that going through this period of hyperinflation actually caused the state of mind of people to move towards authoritarianism, Nazism,
Hmm.
towards Hitler, and back into World War II. So they were just I think, felt very dejected and wanted to rally behind something, and they ended up leading on into World War II. So really interesting book. If you want to learn about how things can go bad with fiat currencies, that's an interesting read, period of time to read about in Weimar. Financial history is really interesting for me to read. I enjoy reading it. So I would say this book's probably a double for me. It was an interesting read. 200 pages about inflation, kind of a crazy story, but
How did they fix it? By going to war? I mean, what fixed it?
so what ended up resolving the issues? I was putting pen to paper last night, and I was going through studying this very thing. So here were some things that they did. So the rent to mark introduction, the Renton mark was backed by real estate and industrial assets, providing with intrinsic value. So they recognized that they needed to back the currency with something. So they did it with industrial assets, real estate, which instilled confidence in the currency. There was a Dawes Plan in 1924. The Dawes Plan was implemented to address Germany's reparation payments and overall economic stability. It restructured Germany's reparation payments, reduced the burdensome obligations, and provided foreign loans to support the German economy. They also created a new central bank. There were new economic reforms. For a while, they had political stability, but obviously that led to Hitler. And so eventually they kind of got back on track, and then they built up and went into World War II. But it's just really interesting to go back, when you hear people talk about inflation in the Weimar Republic, that was a pretty serious time for people, not being able to buy bread so really, really fascinating. Anyways, I probably give it a double. It's a good read. Probably, if you're not interested in money or economic history, don't read Quit.
Read Quit instead. What usually we ask, like, what we can apply. Is there anything to apply here for you?
I think the lesson reading that is be careful with your mental mindset. Running to extremes, going from Marxism to fascism, it didn't really help. And that's hard not to do. And you can see, not to get political, but you can see in the United States the polarization, people running, hard to the left or hard to the right. And so it's helpful for me to kind of read to see when societies move in those big swings, for me to just kind of stay grounded in principles and not just, and not hope in your government to rescue you. I've always had a belief that nobody's coming to save you. And if you have that mindset, you'll always act and do what's in your best favor, your family, your community. If you think somebody's coming to rescue you, you're going to be disappointed and not too happy. So anyways,
well,
when money dies,
if I have to take a wheelbarrow of money to buy bread, I'm going to be extreme somewhere. I don't know where, but I'll probably be extreme as well. So,
like, fix this. Yeah, it's good.
All right. Well, we appreciate everybody joining us for the Pitchbook podcast. Thanks again to Deja Vega for the music, and remember to like and subscribe. Tell a friend about the podcast, and you can find us on Twitter or X at the Pitchbook Pod. And feel free to follow and retweet our awesome tweets. All righty. Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next time.